Inside an old garage, a 5-year-old girl on crutches stopped in shock. Beside her German shepherd, Emily saw a black woman, 60 years old, her frail hands gripping the rusted bars, whispering for help with the last of her strength. In that moment, the silence of the neighborhood was broken by a truth too dark to ignore. This is a story of hidden cruelty and the quiet courage of those who choose to act. Where are you watching from? Share it in the comments, and remember to subscribe so you never miss stories that move the heart. Wishing you a day filled with hope and kindness. It was late afternoon in Cedar Grove, a quiet small town where the air often carried the smell of pine and rain settling over cracked sidewalks. The clouds hung low that day, gray and swollen, and the streets were almost empty except for the occasional bark of a distant dog. Emily, a 5-year-old girl with bright blonde hair that tangled around her face, moved slowly with her crutches, the metal clinking softly against the ground. She had lost her left leg a year earlier in an accident, and since then, every step was a small act of courage. Beside her trotted Rex, a strong German shepherd, 6 years old, with a sable coat of black and tan, ears always erect, eyes amber and alert. He was both protector and companion, his steady presence giving the little girl confidence as they moved along the narrow lane where the houses pressed close together like watchful sentinels. The lane curved past a weathered white house with peeling paint and shutters that hung crooked. It belonged to Clara, a woman in her 30s known for her sharp tongue and stiff smile, though she rarely spoke to the neighbors beyond a curt nod. The house itself looked ordinary, almost dull. But what always caught Emily's attention was the garage that leaned to one side, its metal door rusted, a heavy padlock dangling cold in the fading light. On that day, while balancing on her crutches, Emily's gaze drifted toward the small gap at the bottom of the door, a place where shadows collected. She leaned down slightly, perhaps curious, perhaps guided by something deeper, and in that instant, her young heart froze. Inside the darkness of the garage, pressed against the iron bars of a small inner cage, she saw a figure. It was not a shadow and not her imagination, for the figure shifted and trembled. An elderly black woman, her hair streaked with silver, her frame thin and wasted, crouched low with her hands clinging desperately to the bars. Her fingers were knotted, the skin pale with strain, her eyes wide but dim with exhaustion. With a voice raspy and broken, she whispered only 2 words that carried through the iron and into Emily's bones. "Help me." The sound was so faint that it might have been mistaken for the wind, but Emily knew what she had heard. She stood frozen, unable to breathe, the crutches trembling beneath her arms. Rex reacted instantly. His body stiffened, hackles raised, and he let out a series of sharp guttural barks that shattered the quiet of the lane. He scratched at the ground, pressed his nose against the gap, and growled low as if to shield Emily from the weight of what they had discovered. The woman's eyes flickered toward the dog, and for a brief second, something like hope sparked in them. Emily, however, was overcome with fear. She stumbled back clumsy on her crutches, her heart hammering in her small chest. Her lips parted, but no words came out, only the rush of panic that sent her hurrying away, Rex at her side still growling as though warning the whole world of the secret behind the rusted door. By the time Emily reached home, her face was pale, her breath uneven, and her hands clenched tightly around the handles of her crutches. Jack, her father, was in the kitchen, his tall frame leaning against the worn counter, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand. Jack was 42, a veteran of foreign wars, his dark hair cut short though strands of silver showed at his temples, his face carved by years of hardship and silence. Since returning from service, he had longed for peace, and that peace often meant turning away from trouble rather than stepping into it. When Emily burst in, trembling and wide-eyed, he set the mug down and knelt in front of her, but his expression held more concern for her tears than for her words. "Daddy," Emily whispered, her voice cracking as she clutched his sleeve. "There's a lady. In the garage. She's trapped. She asked for help." Jack blinked, taken aback, but then his brows furrowed in gentle dismissal. He rubbed her shoulder, speaking in the steady tone of someone used to calming nightmares. "Emily, sweetheart, sometimes our eyes and ears play tricks on us. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe just shadows. Don't worry yourself." His words, though kind, carried a weariness that told her he did not believe. Jack had fought too many battles and seen too much loss. Now he avoided conflict whenever he could, and the thought of stirring up trouble with a neighbor was the last thing he wanted. But Emily shook her head violently, tears sliding down her cheeks. Her small voice grew louder, insistent. But Jack only sighed, his shoulders heavy. He turned away as if to end the conversation, but the girl refused to let go. She limped quickly to the small table by the window where her drawing notebook lay. Sniffling, she pulled out a pencil with her tiny fingers and began to sketch furiously, her strokes uneven and trembling. Jack watched in silence, his jaw tightening as the page filled with dark lines, a crude outline of a cage, the bars slanted, a figure hunched inside. The figure's hands clung to the bars, eyes wide with desperation. It was not just a child's doodle, it was a memory too vivid to invent. When Emily finished, she held the paper out with both hands, her lower lip trembling. "She was there, Daddy. I saw her. She looked at me." Her words came out in gasps, her chest rising and falling, but her eyes, large, earnest, and glistening, never wavered. Jack took the drawing and stared at it, the rough lines cutting into him more deeply than he expected. The sketch was clumsy, but it held a truth he could not dismiss. He had seen that look before, the eyes of someone trapped pleading for rescue, and the memory of it clung to him like smoke from old battlefields. Rex moved closer, pressing his head against Jack's arm, letting out a low whine. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong, and in that simple sound Jack felt the weight of confirmation. He looked back at Emily, her face streaked with tears, her small body trembling but her gaze steady, defiant in a way only innocence could be. Something inside him shifted. He could no longer brush it aside as a child's fantasy. Emily was not inventing fear. She was carrying truth too heavy for her little shoulders. Jack exhaled slowly, the lines on his face deepening as he reached out to wipe her tears. Finally, he folded the drawing carefully and set it on the counter. His voice was quiet, steady, but filled with resolve. "All right, Emily, we'll go, you, me, and Rex. We'll see what's really behind that door." Relief washed over Emily's face, her small hands gripping her crutches tighter as if preparing for a mission she had already begun. Rex wagged his tail once, a sharp thump against the floor, as though sealing the vow. Jack rose to his full height, his eyes narrowing, no longer the weary man who turned away from trouble, but the soldier who once stood against darkness. The house grew silent again, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling them softly, as though the world itself waited to see what they would find. Emily stood close to Rex, her head leaning gently against his fur, while Jack stared at the drawing one last time. The crude lines of bars and pleading eyes burned in his mind, a reminder that sometimes even a child's hand could sketch a truth more powerful than words. With that thought, he nodded to himself, already preparing for the path that awaited them, knowing deep down that the peace he had long sought could no longer be preserved by silence. The night had fallen heavy over Cedar Grove, pressing silence onto the narrow streets, broken only by the restless wind moving through the maple trees. Jack walked steadily, his daughter Emily leaning against her crutches beside him, and Rex trotting ahead with his nose close to the ground. The decision had already been made earlier that evening, when Jack looked into Emily's tear-streaked eyes and saw that the drawing she had placed before him was more than just childish scribbles. It was a plea, a truth too raw to ignore, and now the three of them moved together through the darkness toward the house that had long stood as an uneasy silhouette in their minds. The white siding glowed pale under the street lamp, the shutters creaked, and the garage loomed like a silent sentinel. Rex was the first to change the stillness. The German shepherd stiffened, his hackles rising as his sharp nose caught the same scent that had rattled him before. His low growl became a series of barks, each one louder, sharper, echoing down the empty lane until the sound seemed to scrape against the rusted metal of the garage door. Jack felt the tension run down the leash, even though Rex barely needed it. The dog was a force of instinct, powerful, alert, and loyal. Emily clutched her crutches tighter, her knuckles pale, her breath uneven, but her small figure stayed upright, eyes fixed on the door she had once peered through in terror. Her silence was heavy, yet her determination pulled Jack closer, step by cautious step. Jack placed his palm against the cold metal of the door. For a moment he heard nothing, only the sound of his own breath and Rex's low rumble vibrating against the night. But then, faint as a dying flame, came the sound that turned his blood cold, a whisper, ragged, pulled through weak lungs, struggling past cracked lips. "Help me!" The voice was not imagined, not a trick of the wind. It was real, filled with desperation and fading strength. Jack pressed his ear harder against the door, closing his eyes, listening as if his entire body had become a receiver for that plea. When he pulled away, his face had changed, no longer skeptical, no longer dismissive, but etched with the gravity of truth. Emily's voice trembled beside him, small but firm. "That's her, Daddy. That's the lady." Tears welled in her large eyes, reflecting the dim light of the street lamp, her chest heaving with a mixture of fear and relief that someone else now shared her burden. Jack turned to her, and though words stuck in his throat, his nod was enough. He had heard the same woman, the one his daughter had drawn with shaking hands. He reached out and squeezed Emily's shoulder gently, the gesture saying what his lips did not. "I believe you." Rex barked once more, sharp and urgent, as if urging them to act now before the voice inside vanished forever. Without hesitation, Jack pulled at the heavy lock that hung like a sentinel over the garage door. The cold iron resisted, the chain biting into his calloused hands, but he gritted his teeth and yanked harder. The metal rattled, clanged, but it would not break. Years of war had taught Jack to push through resistance, yet this door mocked him with its unyielding strength. He braced his shoulder against it, trying again, the sound of the woman's faint breathing haunting him on the other side. Emily stood close, whispering, "Please, Daddy, please." But even as Jack's strength surged, the lock held firm, unbroken, stubborn against his desperate effort. The clang of failure echoed into the night. It was then that a sudden voice cut into the tense air. "Jack, Emily, out for a late walk, are we?" Clara's tone was smooth, her words polished, but her eyes carried the edge of suspicion. She appeared at the corner of the house, tall and composed, auburn hair catching what little light the moon offered. She wore a fitted blouse, her shoulders straight, and her silver watch glinted as her arm crossed over her chest. To anyone else, she looked like the perfect neighbor. Poised, polite, controlled, but in that moment her presence was a sharp intrusion. Her gaze drifted quickly to Rex, still bristling and growling at the garage, then back to Jack with a smile too thin to be kind. Jack's heart thudded, but his face remained calm, honed by years of discipline. He turned casually, forcing a smile as if nothing was amiss. "Rex needed some air," he said lightly, tugging gently at the leash. "Emily couldn't sleep, so we thought we'd stretch our legs. You know how restless kids can be." Clara's eyes lingered on him, weighing his words, then flicked briefly toward the garage door, though she did not step closer. Her lips curved upward, but the smile never touched her eyes. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "Dogs do have their instincts, don't they? But do be careful. People talk when they see neighbors wandering late at night near other people's property." Emily clutched her father's hand, her eyes wide and frightened, but Jack squeezed gently to reassure her. He knew better than to confront Clara now, not when the odds were against them and the lock still mocked his strength. He forced a laugh, shaking his head as though embarrassed by Rex's loud barking. "He's a handful sometimes," Jack added, his tone casual, though inside every nerve screamed caution. Clara studied them for another long second, her watch ticking like a metronome in the silence, before finally offering a polite nod and retreating back toward the house. The click of her heels against the walkway faded slowly, until the night reclaimed its quiet. Only when Clara had vanished did Jack let out the breath he had been holding. His jaw tightened, his eyes dark, as he looked once more at the locked door. Behind it, the faint sound of labored breathing had faded back into silence, but he knew now that the truth was undeniable. Emily's drawing had not been a child's fancy. It was a testimony, and the whispers had confirmed it. He placed a steadying hand on Rex, who still trembled with restrained fury, then looked down at Emily, whose eyes brimmed with both hope and dread. He lowered himself to her height and whispered firmly, "We'll come back, but not like this. Next time, we'll be ready." Emily nodded, though tears slid down her cheeks, and Rex pressed close to her, his body warm against the cool night air. Jack rose, his shoulders squared, the soldier in him awake once more. He turned them toward home, his expression hardening with the weight of a vow he had not spoken aloud. Tonight had shown him enough. The woman inside that garage was real, suffering, waiting for someone to act. And though Clara's smile had been as polished as glass, it was no disguise for the shadows she was guarding. As they walked away, Emily glanced back one last time at the rusted door, her heart heavy but no longer alone. Jack would not ignore this. He had chosen to see, and now there was no turning away. The night wrapped them once again as they left the lane behind, the sound of their footsteps steady against the cracked pavement. The old garage stood silent, but its secret no longer belonged to shadows. Jack carried it now, in the tension of his jaw, in the pounding of his heart, and in the unspoken promise that he would return. Emily leaned on her crutches. Rex walked close, and together they disappeared into the darkness, not as bystanders, but as witnesses who knew what lay hidden and who had already begun to plan what came next. The days following that tense night seemed to stretch endlessly over Cedar Grove, the autumn air thick with the weight of secrets that refused to stay hidden. Jack carried the memory of the frail voice behind the garage door like a wound that would not heal, while Emily remained restless, her drawings multiplying into pages of crude bars, tired eyes, and trembling hands that clung to iron. Rex, too, grew more agitated with each passing evening, pacing at the window, ears pricked, nostrils flaring at scents that humans could not trace. But they were not the only ones unsettled. Clara had noticed, and suspicion had begun to flicker in her sharp eyes, suspicion that would soon turn dangerous. It started subtly, with her gaze lingering a little too long when Emily passed by on her crutches, or the way her lips pursed whenever Rex barked near the garage. Then came the new locks, thick chains gleaming under the porch light, their metallic clank an unmistakable signal of her intent to tighten control. Neighbors might have thought her simply cautious, protecting valuables, but Jack saw through the facade. He recognized the way guilty hands worked, overly careful, desperate to hide. Clara made a point of checking the yard more often, stepping outside under the pretense of tending to potted plants or collecting the mail late at night, but her eyes never strayed far from the garage. Jack knew the habits of those who feared discovery. One evening, while keeping his distance across the street, he watched Clara emerge from her house just past midnight, a small basket in her arms. She moved with purpose, her heels muffled against the damp earth, her auburn hair pinned in its usual twist, but her composure frayed slightly under the pale wash of moonlight. She paused once, scanning the shadows as if aware of unseen eyes, then slipped a key into the garage door and disappeared inside. Jack's jaw tightened as he saw the faint glow of a lamp through the crack beneath the door, the outline of her silhouette moving within. When she re-emerged, the basket was empty, her face set in icy determination. He had all the confirmation he needed. Someone lived in that darkness, and Clara was feeding her. Fear of exposure sharpened Clara's resolve, and in her private thoughts, the edges of desperation carved into something more sinister. She began to move items into the garage that did not belong there. Cans of chemical solvents from her husband's workshop, heavy furniture dragged across the floor, and a rusted filing cabinet placed near the door. She rehearsed the scene in her mind, how easily an accident could be explained. A collapse of unstable shelves, fumes from spilled chemicals, a tragic mishap in a cluttered storage space. The woman inside would be silenced forever, and Clara would mourn outwardly with practiced grace, her polished mask intact. It was a plan born not of impulse, but of cold, calculated cruelty, one that turned the garage into a stage for her deception. But shadows hold more than secrets. They carry warnings, too. Rex was the first to notice the change. His nose twitched violently one evening when the wind shifted, carrying the acrid sting of chemical fumes from Clara's yard. The dog stiffened, growled, and began to bark with frantic urgency, clawing at the door as though he could tear through it with sheer will. Jack, startled by the intensity of his partner's reaction, followed the dog into the night, his boots striking the pavement with steady rhythm. Emily watched from the porch, fear clenching her chest, but she trusted Rex's instincts and her father's experience. Something was happening, and it was happening now. The closer they came, the stronger the smell became, sharp, burning, unnatural in the cool night air. Jack's soldier's senses returned in full force, every nerve alive, his heartbeat steady but fast. He motioned Rex forward, and the German shepherd led him straight to the garage, where the faint light glowed through cracks and a low metallic creak echoed from within. Jack's breath caught as he peered through a narrow slit, catching sight of Clara herself, her figure bent and strained as she dragged the filing cabinet toward the corner where the frail woman huddled. The basket of food had been replaced by bottles and rags, their labels screaming danger even in the dim light. Clara's face was twisted with a determination that bordered on frenzy, her polished exterior stripped away to reveal the raw cruelty beneath. Jack did not wait. He pushed the door hard, his shoulder striking the frame, the rattle of the lock sending a thunderclap through the silent street. Clara jerked upright, eyes wide, her hands tightening on the edge of the cabinet. The garage smelled of rust and chemical fumes, sharp enough to sting Jack's nose, but he didn't flinch. "Step away," he commanded, his voice low but unyielding, the tone of a man who had faced worse than this in deserts and cities far from Cedar Grove. Clara's eyes flickered, her chest heaving, then narrowed into defiance. "You don't understand," she spat, her voice breaking the fragile mask. "She ruins everything." Her words cut like glass, sharp and desperate. The tension exploded in an instant as Clara lunged toward the shelves, her hand closing on one of the solvent cans. Jack surged forward, his hand striking her wrist, the can clattering to the floor with a metallic crash that sent fumes hissing into the air. Rex barked furiously, darting around the space, his body circling Clara like a predator guarding its pack. Clara twisted violently, her eyes wild, her hair falling loose from its immaculate twist. She fought with a strength born of panic, clawing at Jack, trying to shove him back into the clutter of the garage. But Jack, hardened by years of combat, absorbed the blows with a grim set of his jaw, his hands locking around her arms, forcing them down. The woman inside whimpered, her hands clutching the bars tighter, eyes wide in terror. "Enough!" Jack growled, his voice booming against the walls, silencing even Rex for a heartbeat. Clara froze for a fraction of a second, her chest heaving, sweat shining at her temples. But then the fury returned, and she wrenched against his grip with renewed desperation. "You don't know what she is," she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. Jack held her fast, his face inches from hers, his eyes burning with the certainty of a man who had seen evil in too many forms. "I know what you are," he replied, steady and sharp, the words striking harder than any physical blow. Rex growled deeply, pressing closer, his body a wall of muscle and loyalty between Emily's world and Clara's madness. At last, Clara's strength faltered, her body sagging against his grip, her breath ragged. The garage reeked of chemicals, overturned rags littering the floor, the cabinet leaning precariously where she had left it. Jack shoved her back against the wall, pinning her with the weight of his frame, his voice cold as steel. "This ends tonight." Her lips parted, eyes flashing with defiance, but the fight was gone from her limbs. The frail woman inside let out a broken sob, her forehead pressed to the bars as though releasing years of pent-up agony. Jack's heart pounded, but his resolve remained firm. He tightened his grip one last time, knowing the moment had tipped in his favor. The night outside remained silent, the street empty, the stars hidden behind drifting clouds. But inside that garage, the battle lines had been drawn and crossed, and for the first time, Clara's iron grip on her secret had been broken. Jack released her slowly, stepping back but never lowering his guard, his body still between her and the trembling figure behind the bars. Rex stood at his side, chest heaving, ears pricked, tail rigid, ready to spring again if needed. The air was heavy with fumes, but heavier still with the truth that could no longer be contained. Clara's plan had failed, and Jack knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning to come. The garage stank of chemicals and sweat, the air sharp with the bitter tang of solvents, but Jack pushed past it, his body alive with urgency. Clara writhed under his grip, her eyes wild, but for a heartbeat she faltered, and in that moment Jack seized his chance. With a swift motion born from years of battlefield instinct, he slammed his shoulder against the lock once more. The chain groaned, the padlock cracked against the strained metal, and with a final wrench it snapped free. The door flew open with a metallic scream, and the shadows inside seemed to recoil as light from the street lamp spilled across the floor. Behind the bars, slumped and barely breathing, was the frail figure of Martha Johnson. She looked older than her 60 years, her ebony skin drawn thin against her bones, her hair a wild halo of silver strands that clung damp with sweat. Her eyes, dim but alive, widened at the sight of Jack forcing his way in, and her trembling hands clutched the bars as though afraid the vision would vanish. Jack dropped to one knee, pulling the lock away with furious speed, then pushed the heavy barrier aside. "You're safe," he murmured, reaching in and gathering her with careful strength. She was light as paper, her body limp, but she clung weakly to his arm, the whisper of gratitude trembling on her lips, though no sound escaped. Rex barked once, sharp and protective, circling them as if daring Clara to take one step closer. Clara's composure shattered in the open air, and she erupted with a scream that tore through the night. "She's insane! You don't understand!" Her voice was high, almost shrill, her face contorted, red blotches rising beneath the porcelain mask she usually wore so carefully. "Martha doesn't belong in the world. She rants, she claws, she's dangerous. I had to keep her locked away." Her words poured like poison, desperate and unhinged, her arms flailing as if she could wave away the truth now standing in the night for all to see. But Jack did not flinch. He cradled Martha close, shielding her frail form, while Rex growled low and deep, each rumble a warning that the woman's reign of control was ending. The commotion had drawn the neighbors, one by one, their doors opening, lights flickering on as shadows gathered at the edge of lawns. Faces peered out in shock, murmurs rippling through the small crowd that had formed, whispers rising and falling as people saw the sight of Martha, long believed to have disappeared, now revealed in the arms of the veteran. Jack's voice carried over the gathering, strong and clear, each word landing with the force of truth. "This woman," he said, pointing directly at Clara, "locked her own mother-in-law in that garage. She let her waste away in silence, hidden like shame." His words silenced the murmurs, replacing them with sharp intakes of breath and gasps of horror. Clara shook her head violently, her hands raised, but the neighbors' stares pressed against her like a noose tightening. From the back of the crowd came another figure, Thomas Hale, Clara's husband, a man in his late 40s with sloped shoulders and tired eyes that had long since given up their fire. His hair was streaked with gray at the temples, his shirt wrinkled, his face sagging under the weight of avoidance. For a moment he stood frozen, his gaze darting between Clara, Martha, and the community gathered around them. Jack's voice cut toward him like a blade. "You knew." The words were not a question, but a verdict. The crowd turned as one, waiting for his denial, but none came. Thomas lowered his head, his lips quivering, his voice little more than a broken whisper. "I knew," he confessed, shame trembling in every syllable. "I knew she was in there, but I said nothing. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet." The admission was gasoline to fire. Neighbors shouted in outrage, their anger boiling over, faces twisted with disgust. A woman from across the street shook her head in disbelief, her arms crossed as she spat. "You let this happen for peace." Another man muttered curses under his breath, shaking his fist toward Clara. Thomas's cowardice stood naked in the glow of the porch lights, and his shoulders hunched further under the collective weight of their scorn. Emily clutched her crutches at the edge of the scene, her eyes wide and wet, staring at Thomas with the kind of disappointment a child should never feel toward an adult meant to protect. She pressed herself closer to Rex, who stood tall and bristling, a living barrier between innocence and betrayal. Clara, still defiant, pointed a shaking finger at Martha, her voice raw and ragged. "She's not the victim. She's unstable. She always has been. You're all blind." But her words no longer carried the power of control. Instead, they fell flat, swallowed by the crowd's fury and Jack's unflinching presence. Jack stepped forward, his stance solid, Martha sheltered behind him. "She's a survivor," he countered, his voice thunderous, "and you are nothing but a coward hiding behind lies." Rex barked sharply, the sound cracking like a whip, and the crowd stirred, voices rising in agreement, their outrage fusing into something larger than fear. Clara's face twisted, her beauty broken into something sharp and hollow, her polished facade in ruins. At last, the wail of sirens broke through the shouts, red and blue lights flashing down the street, their beams bouncing across the houses like judgment itself arriving. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt, doors flung open, officers rushing toward the chaos. Leading them was Officer Luke Bennett, a tall man in his 30s, steady-eyed and strong, his sandy hair cropped close, his frame carrying both discipline and compassion. At his side, the German Shepherd Ranger padded firmly, nostrils flaring as though already recognizing the scent of fear and cruelty lingering in the air. "Step back!" Luke commanded, his voice calm but firm as he moved toward Clara, whose protests had devolved into incoherent shrieks. The officers took in the scene swiftly. The frail Martha collapsed against Jack, the furious community pressing close, and Clara, still flailing with venom in her words. Luke's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he nodded to his team. "Cuff her!" The metallic click of handcuffs snapped across the night, final and undeniable, as Clara's wrists were bound before the eyes of the neighbors she had fooled for so long. She kicked, spat, cursed, but her words no longer mattered. The people she once charmed now glared with disgust, their whispers laced with fury. Her silver watch glinted once before being swallowed by the firm grip of the officer, leading her toward the patrol car. Jack stood tall in the center of it all. Martha held carefully against him. Emily pressed to his side, Rex stationed like a sentinel. The neighbors drew closer, some murmuring thanks, others shaking their heads at the horror revealed in their midst. Thomas, still slumped, sank against the porch rail, his face gray with shame, ignored even by those who had once called him a friend. Jack said nothing further. The truth was already laid bare, and silence now carried more weight than words. The officers recorded the scene, gathering statements, their pens scratching down evidence of cruelty long hidden. But the most powerful testimony lay in the eyes of the community, who had seen with their own eyes and would not forget. As Clara was shoved into the back of the patrol car, her screams muffled by the closing door, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring in disbelief and anger. The night air grew cooler, the sirens fading, but the weight of what had been uncovered lingered like smoke. Jack adjusted his hold on Martha, who leaned against him weakly, her lips moving soundlessly in gratitude. Emily looked up at her father, her small face pale but fierce, and Rex pressed against her leg, his tail sweeping once across the pavement as though declaring victory. The truth had been dragged into the light, and no lock, no lie, no silence could ever seal it again. The courthouse of Cedar Grove stood solemn beneath the gray morning sky, its stone columns rising like ancient guardians of truth. Days had passed since the garage door was forced open, and now the town gathered once again, but not in whispers across porches or behind curtains. They came to witness justice, to see Clara Hale, once the polished face of respectability, face the judgment of law and community. The air inside the courtroom was thick, the wooden benches filled with neighbors, their eyes sharp, their silence heavy with condemnation. Jack sat near the front, Emily at his side with her crutches resting against the bench, Rex lying faithfully at their feet, his steady breathing a quiet reminder of loyalty. Clara entered flanked by 2 officers, her wrists bound, though her posture remained rigid, her chin tilted high as if dignity could still be salvaged from disgrace. She wore a plain gray dress provided by the county, her auburn hair no longer swept into careful waves, but loose and unkempt, the polish stripped away to reveal a face hardened by rage and fear. Her eyes darted across the crowd, searching perhaps for sympathy, but found only the averted gazes of neighbors who once smiled politely at her charity drives and pies, at school fundraisers. Now those same neighbors sat stone-faced, lips pressed into thin lines of betrayal. Clara's mask had shattered, and there was no stage left for her performance. The judge, an older man named Harold Green, with a weathered face and clear blue eyes, presided with steady gravity. His robe flowed heavy over his frame, his gavel resting like a silent warning on the bench before him. He read aloud the charges: abuse, unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment, each word struck like a hammer, echoing across the wooden walls, forcing Clara to flinch despite her rigid facade. She tried once to speak, her voice trembling with remnants of her old authority, claiming she had acted for safety, for order, but the evidence stood undeniable. The photographs of the rusted garage, the testimonies of neighbors, and the frail body of Martha Johnson herself painted a truth too brutal to be hidden. At Clara's side sat Thomas, her husband, no longer dressed in the tidy collared shirts that had once given him the appearance of reliability. Instead, he wore the plain clothes of a man under custody, his hands trembling as he twisted them in his lap. His face was drawn and gray, his eyes hollow, unable to meet those of his neighbors, unable even to glance toward Jack, who had dragged the truth into daylight. When asked to speak, Thomas admitted in broken tones that he had known all along, that fear of losing comfort had chained him into silence. His words were met with audible gasps, then with low murmurs of fury. The silence of a man had proven as deadly as cruelty itself. Martha Johnson appeared at last, escorted gently by a nurse and the paramedic Sarah who had tended to her that first night. Martha's body remained frail, her steps slow, her frame cloaked in a shawl, but her presence filled the room with a quiet strength. Her ebony skin, lined with years of hardship, seemed to glow faintly under the courthouse lights, her eyes deep wells of resilience. She did not speak long, only enough to tell the court that she had been locked away by those meant to protect her, and that only the small hand of a child and the steadfast loyalty of a dog had brought her back into the light. She turned toward Emily then, her lips curving into a smile soft as morning sun. "My little angel," she whispered, the words trembling with both love and gratitude. Emily, cheeks flushed, clutched Jack's arm and pressed her crutches closer. She was only 5, her legs unsteady, one of them fashioned from the cold gleam of metal, yet her courage shone brighter than the shame of adults twice, 3 times her age. In her silence, in her drawings, in her insistence, she had sparked the chain that unraveled cruelty. Jack looked down at her, his throat tight, knowing she had carried more bravery than most men he had served beside. Rex nuzzled against her leg, his amber eyes steady and watchful, the embodiment of loyalty and strength that needed no words. The courtroom seemed to lean toward her, recognizing without declaration that compassion had found its champion in the smallest voice. The verdict came swiftly, inevitable as sunrise. Clara was sentenced for her crimes, her outbursts ignored, her polished excuses swept aside by truth laid bare. She was led away in handcuffs once more, her cries echoing uselessly against the walls as the community turned their faces. Thomas, too, received his judgment, not as harsh as Clara's, but enough to mark his silence as complicity. His head hung low as the gavel struck, and he was taken away, his image forever broken in the eyes of those who had once trusted him. Silence had been his shield, but now it was his prison. Outside the courthouse, the morning light broke through the heavy clouds, painting Cedar Grove in pale gold. Martha stood at the steps, leaning on her nurse but holding her chin high, her breath steady despite the weight of her past. Emily moved beside her, Jack steady at her other side, and Rex pressed close, their figures bound together, not by blood but by shared courage. Neighbors stood scattered across the lawn, some with tears, some with grim expressions, all watching as the unlikely group emerged. There were no cheers, no applause, only a heavy silence filled with respect, sorrow, and the quiet acknowledgement that justice had finally spoken. Jack reached out, his large hand steady as it took Martha's frail one, Emily's smaller hand slipping into the other. Together they walked forward, their shadows stretching long in the morning sun. Rex trotted close, ears pricked, tail sweeping once in the cool air, his amber gaze locked on the path ahead. Behind them, Clara and Thomas were driven away in separate cars, the weight of their choices sealed by the community's judgment. Ahead, the street stretched quiet and clean, free at last of the darkness that had festered too long behind locked doors. The story ended, not with triumph shouted from rooftops, but with a silence that spoke louder than words. Clara and Thomas paid the price of cruelty and cowardice, while Martha, frail but unbroken, found strength again in kindness. Emily had proven that courage did not come from age or strength, but from a heart unwilling to turn away. Jack, Rex, and Martha did not stay to bask in gratitude. They walked forward in silence, their bond unspoken yet unbreakable. And as the community watched, the lesson remained clear. When silence is broken by compassion, even the darkest secrets lose their power. In the end, This story reminds us that compassion does not need strength of arms, but the courage of the heart. Silent sacrifices, like those of Emily and Rex, often shine brighter than the loudest voices. When one person dares to care, even the darkest secrets can be brought into the light. I invite you to share this story with others, leave a comment about what you are thinking right now, and subscribe so you never miss these journeys of hope and truth. May God bless you and protect your family as we continue to walk together in kindness.